So this is part 3 of my MIP SP-2 four-wheel drive conversion project. And since the last video, I had the rear gearbox pretty much all set with the slipper clutch and everything. I figured I would just do a mock-up of the front and rear gearboxes with the chain installed, just to see how it would look effectively. I'm waiting on a rear bulkhead to come in so I can cut the hole in that and run the chain through. But I figured I'd mount these just to get a look of everything for the time being. So one thing that is worth pointing out here, and let's see if I can get it from the instructions just to show you it's not that. Okay, it's the other one. It should be this guy. Yeah, so in the original instructions, what it recommended doing is, okay, you put this chain guide here, it's like a tensioner, and you would end up running the battery widthwise across the chassis and then mounting the servo back over here. And I had already done something kind of like this with my 410 Legend project. So I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to try to run the battery in the original stick pack configuration. But in order to do that, you actually have to use this tensioner a little bit differently. So normally you would run the chain, well, you call it chain guide, call it tensioner, whatever you want. You would run the chain guide such that the chain itself goes, the bottom piece goes over this piece here and then under this top piece. And then the top piece here kind of threads in between this top bearing and this, basically where this bottom piece is going right now, this top piece would otherwise go in, and then the bottom piece would go under that bearing on this guy here. But I moved these basically one notch up, so the top piece is on top and the bottom piece is on this top bearing, so that way I can lift up the bottom of the chain so that I can basically have enough clearance to run a stick pack configuration. And by the time I mount the bulkhead, for example, this will ride up a little bit, so I'd have clearance. I had two reasons for doing that. One is that I did want to try something different from the original setup, but also I do have this nice MIP battery plate, and I want to be able to use it for one of my four-wheel drive projects. And since I couldn't use it on my Legend project, I want to try to use it here, which means running it this way. Now this does create some problems because there's basically now nowhere to put the servo. There's very little space here with the way the steering rack mounts. You do have to mount it back. At full throw, it runs against these mounting holes. So I can't quite put the servo here, can't really put it here. I was thinking maybe I could get a low profile servo and cut out the mounting arms and maybe tape it in, or maybe I can run it in a stand-up configuration over here. Maybe there's a way to actually make it work. So I'll play around with that and see what works best. So that's sort of kind of where that is right now. Let's see, I think there was something I wanted to mention. You'll notice I am using the factory team blue aluminum screws and ball studs and nuts. And I just did that to provide some kind of, newish sort of look, a nice little blue accent to it. One thing to point out, though, is that the blue aluminum screws, these guys here, are really soft. So if you actually do this, it's worth taking just some other screw, like a beater screw, for example, an 832 thread, and pre-tapping all of the holes before you actually thread these blue screws in. Because the head here is so soft, when you screw it in with your Phillips head screwdriver, it can actually sort of distort the Phillips openings here, and it can look really monkey. So pre-tap all the holes first and then run this. Another thing to note, I had mentioned in the first video that I wanted to run my orange chassis with this, but because I had to drill holes for the tensioner, and I also did end up having to drill new holes for the steering rack, I decided to use just a re-released World's Car chassis for that. So it turns out that the front gearbox is a bit fatter than the 410 Legend gearbox. And in order to make space for that, you do have to pull the steering rack back. The MIP 410 Legend steering rack didn't quite have short enough arms to be able to fit that shorter rack with the stock mounting holes for the steering rack. So you do have to drill these holes a little further back, and you also have to drill them out. And in order to account for the steering rack throw, you do have to drill out, or grind out, or whatever you want. You have to cut out this sort of triangular opening here on either side to let the actual arms from the steering rack throw all the way without hitting the chassis. Okay, now as a result of that, if you're going to use a newer front nose plate, so this is a re-released front nose plate, some of you may be able to tell that the AE logo here doesn't have the curved topography that the vintage nose plate has. So this is a newer nose plate. And the newer nose plates are already cut triangularly. They don't have a sort of a square or rectangular cut to them. And what that means is with the older nose, let's see if I can find an example here. If we go, yeah, I guess here. So with the older nose would be perfectly square like this. And so you would actually drill these two holes here through both the chassis and the nose. But because this nose already has a V cut in it, you're only drilling these two holes through the chassis, and the new nose kind of gets around that. So in order to mount the nose, you do have to still use the 3 older mounting points for the nose, but you need to use shorter screws in order to clear the steering rack. So you use the 832 by 1/4 inch flathead screws. Okay, 6931 is part number. And you just use 3 of those, and that'll mount the nose just fine. And then you just play games with using little spacers under the steering rack to lift everything up so that you clear the screws, and so that your this cross brace here also clears the chassis. There's no rubbing or grinding or anything. And what's interesting about this cross brace is that it doesn't pivot on bearings. It actually pivots on the threads of the screws. So you screw in, say, this screw through the aluminum steering arm, and then it screws into this fiberglass piece here, and it just, the screw basically screws in and unscrews out as this thing sort of rotates around. So you have to make the spacing between the fiberglass piece and the aluminum piece just right so that there's not significant amounts of binding as this steering rack throws left and right. One thing I also had to do with the length of screw I used here is put a small, I think it's a 1mm spacer on the top between the screw head and the steering rack, just to make sure that the bottom thread actually doesn't run into the chassis. It actually clears the nose plate here. Okay, so this all seems to work okay. No problems or anything. The actual screw head itself also does not run into the chain here. Okay, maybe a little hard to see with the focus, but it all runs nice and clear. So it was a little bit nerve-wracking to actually drill these 2 holes, as well as these 2 holes, as well as grinding out the front shock tower to make sure that the front gearbox fits through everything. This is an original front shock tower. Okay, it's just, making sure you get your measurements right, especially with these bottom holes here, because what you get is a template, and this is printed 1-to-1, so you could, in theory, just put this over the chassis and mark the holes. But the problem is you can't see through this. So you could maybe get some see-through kind of paper, or I don't know, maybe like decal paper or something. But I tried to do it with just normal white paper here up against the light, and to mark off all the points. And then what I did is I put some masking tape onto the chassis, and I tried to make sure I got the holes lined up, because I can kind of see through this white paper. And then sort of secure the paper against the chassis, and then just poke holes through the mounting point positions and make sure that everything's right. And I'd make markings in the masking tape with a pencil, and then I'd take the paper off, and then I would just measure where those pencil markings were to make sure that it's all symmetric. I didn't get it completely perfect on this side. I had to actually drill 2 holes, but I drilled small holes, so that way it kind of worked out. I could just use my, whatever you call this, I forgot the name for this, but this is what you use to make angled cuts in the holes, and it just kind of bored out those two small holes into one big hole with the countersinks in them. That's what it is. It's a countersink. So it looks okay. There's a little bit of silver lining around this screw here. It's not completely perfect, but it's good enough. And these two holes here, the screws that you use to mount the front gearbox are really tiny thread. Let me see if I can find. They are a 2-56 by I used a 5/16 inch long flathead screw. So it's this kind of thread, 256. So it's a really tiny screw. It's almost like a 0.05 inch type of, well, that's the screw head you use, but the screw thread is very, very small. So when you drill the holes in the nose here, the holes, if you use like a normal drill bit, they'll end up being a bit larger than the actual screw. And then when you countersink the hole, it'll be a little bit larger than the actual screw head, but that's okay. I mean, at least it doesn't look ugly or anything. Let's see, the MIP gearbox that I'm using in the rear, it mounts using two screws, two 832 screws. It does not use the 440 screws. It's only two of these guys, and it doesn't use the standard length screw. I think this is like a 3/8 inch screw. It uses, I think, a 1/4 inch. These two, I think, are 1/4 inch screws. Otherwise, if you try to thread a 3/8 inch screw in, it'll just get caught, and you won't be able to thread it all the way in. And I actually sort of ruined two nice aluminum blue 832 inch screws, or 832 thread screws that way. So then I had to go to a shorter screw to make this all work, so that's fine. Let's see, is there anything else I want to mention here? I think that more or less covers where I am right now. Again, when the bulkhead comes in, I'll drill the hole through that, mount the chain through it. Then I'll work on the rear shock tower, and I'll work on the arms and everything. One thing that might get a little tricky is the CVDs, and the reason for that is the chain drive kit did come with a pair of universals that were meant for the short arm RC10. Now I don't have those universals, and that's okay because I don't intend on running a short arm front. I intend on running the standard sort of long arm front that you would find on a teen car or a world's car. But now I have to make sure that I have the right CVD for that. So I do have from my 410 Legend, if I go in here, I have these guys, these longer CVD dog bones that were meant for the long front arm kit. So I'm going to try to use these. But the problem I have now is that between the left and right ends, one of the wheel axles is actually a B4 wheel axle that the previous owner put on. I only have one wheel axle that was original from the 410 Legend kit. So I have to play around and to find CVD wheel axles that will fit in this assembly. I did see some associated TC3 CVD wheel axles that might be just the right size. I ordered those the other day, so we'll see how they fit. If they fit, then I'll just use this assembly. I won't try to play any games with using a different caster block and a different steering block like what I did with the 410 Legend. I want to use the original MIP parts for this particular project here. So the front will hopefully not be a big deal if those TC3 units actually work. If not, then I have to try a little harder and find another solution. For the rear, I'll probably keep it simple and just use standard, RC10 rear arms, the standard rear hub carrier, and the World's Car CVAs. That way, I don't have to do anything silly to get a rear, part of the drivetrain to work. Let's see. Yep, so I think that's it for now. In time, probably maybe a week or two, I'll have a little bit more progress done on this as the parts come in the mail. So I hope you like it so far. I do like the blue accents. Hopefully this will look nice when it's all finished, but we'll have to see. So in the meantime, thanks for watching.